truth will set you free unless telling it means dying for it. After 18 years on death row for a crime he didn't commit, Damian Mercer was given a choice. Admit you're a killer and walk free, or maintain your innocence and die by lethal injection. The fluorescent lights in the Arkansas State Prison conference room hummed with the same mechanical indifference they had for nearly 2 decades. Damian sat across from his attorneys, his wrists still bearing the phantom weight of shackles that had been removed only moments before. At 36 years old, he had spent more than half his life behind these walls, waiting for a needle that would end what remained of his existence. And now, impossibly, he was being offered a way out, but the price was his soul. If stories like this grip your heart, consider subscribing to The Cost of Truth. Your support helps us bring these forgotten voices to light, like, and follow. For more stories that challenge what we think we know about justice, the document before him bore the weight of legal language that meant something far simpler than its complexity suggested. An Alford plea, a legal mechanism that would allow Damian to maintain his innocence while simultaneously pleading guilty. He would walk out of prison within days. He would breathe free air. He would see the sky without chain link. Framing it like a cruel picture, all he had to do was say the words. All he had to do was admit to murdering 3 boys he had never touched. But to understand the impossible choice Damian Mercer faced in that conference room, we need to go back 18 years to a spring evening in 1993, when 3 children rode their bicycles into the woods and never came home. Ridge Creek, Arkansas was the kind of town that time seemed to forget, nestled in the northeastern corner of the state. It was a place where everyone knew everyone, where church attendance was mandatory in social, if not legal terms, and where anything different was viewed with suspicion bordering on hostility. The population hovered around 26,000 souls, most of them working-class families who had lived there for generations. On May 5, 1993, 3 second-grade boys, Michael Patterson, Stephen Marshall, and Christopher Wilson, finished their homework, grabbed their bicycles, and told their parents they were going to play in Robin Hood Hills, a wooded area near a drainage ditch that served as an informal playground for neighborhood children. The evening was warm. The sun wouldn't set for hours. There was no reason to worry. By nightfall, the boys hadn't returned home. By midnight, search parties were combing the woods with flashlights. By dawn, the entire town had mobilized, and by the following afternoon, the bodies of all 3 children were found in a shallow creek, bound with their own shoelaces, showing signs of brutal violence that would haunt Ridge Creek for decades. The murders sent shockwaves through the community. This wasn't supposed to happen here. Not in their town. Not to their children. The grief was overwhelming, but it was quickly overtaken by something else: a desperate, consuming need to find someone responsible, someone to blame, someone to punish, and the town had already decided who that someone would be. What happened next would destroy 3 more lives and expose the terrifying power of collective fear. Damian Mercer was 18 years old in 1993, lived with his mother in a trailer park on the outskirts of Ridge Creek, surviving on welfare and food stamps while trying to figure out what his life was supposed to become. He was intelligent, too intelligent for a town that valued conformity over curiosity, and he had learned to escape through books, music, and a rich inner world that set him apart from his peers. He wore black. He listened to Metallic. He read Stephen King novels and books about Wicca from the public library. He wrote poetry in journals that he kept hidden under his mattress. He was, by every measurable standard, a misfit, a teenager who didn't fit the mold that Ridge Creek had prepared for its young men. In most towns. In most times, Damien would have been nothing more than an outsider waiting to graduate and leave. But Ridge Creek in 1993 was not most towns, and 1993 was not most times. America was in the grip of what historians would later call the Satanic Panic, a widespread moral hysteria that convinced millions of ordinary people that secret satanic cults were operating in their communities, abducting children and performing ritual sacrifices. There was no evidence for any of this. There never had been. But belief doesn't require evidence. Fear certainly doesn't. When the Ridge Creek Police Department began investigating the murders of 3 innocent children, they didn't look at forensic evidence. They didn't analyze crime scenes. They didn't follow leads that pointed toward more likely suspects. Instead, they looked for someone who fit the profile of a satanic killer, someone different, someone strange, someone the community already feared and distrusted. They found Damien Mercer, but here's what the investigators chose to ignore. There was no physical evidence connecting Damien to the crime. None. Within weeks of the murders, police had focused their entire investigation on Damien and 2 of his acquaintances, Jason Caldwell, 16 years old, and Marcus Wheeler, 17. Jason was Damien's closest friend, a quiet teenager who spent most of his time drawing and dreaming of becoming an artist. Marcus was intellectually disabled, with an IQ that placed him in the borderline range, making him vulnerable to manipulation and suggestion. The case against them was built not on evidence, but on perception. Investigators noted Damien's interest in the occult, meaning his library books about Wicca, a nature-based religion with no connection to Satanism. They noted his black clothing, his taste in heavy metal music, and his habit of keeping to himself. They interviewed townspeople who called him weird and creepy, who whispered that he worshipped the devil, who remembered seeing him walking near the woods months before the murders. None of this was evidence. All of it was prejudice, but it was enough. Marcus Wheeler was brought in for questioning. On June 3, 1993, the interrogation lasted 12 hours. Marcus, who could barely read, who had never been in serious trouble, who trusted authority figures because he had been taught to trust them, was questioned without a lawyer present and without his parents being informed. The detectives told him they already knew he was guilty. They told him they had evidence. They told him that if he confessed and named his accomplices, things would go easier for him by the end of the interrogation. Marcus had given a confession that would seal all 3 teenagers' fates. The confession should have fallen apart the moment anyone examined it closely, but no one wanted to examine it closely. Marcus Wheeler's statement was riddled with factual errors that should have immediately discredited it. He said the murders happened at noon when the boys weren't even in the woods until evening. He described the victims' injuries incorrectly. He placed the crime in a different location than where the bodies were found. He contradicted himself repeatedly throughout the 12-hour interrogation. When confronted with these inconsistencies, Marcus would simply change his story to match whatever the detectives suggested. The official recording of the interrogation captured only fragments of what actually occurred. Investigators later admitted that the tape had been turned off and on multiple times, leaving hours of questioning undocumented. But none of this mattered to a town desperate for justice. None of this mattered to a media environment that had already convicted the 3 teenagers in the court of public opinion. Local newspapers ran headlines about satanic rituals. Television stations broadcast images of Damien in his black clothing, looking exactly like the monster the community needed him to be. By the time the trials began in early 1994, Ridge Creek had already decided the outcome. What the jury never heard would have changed everything. But the truth wasn't what anyone wanted. The trials were held in Crittenden County, the same community where the murders had occurred. Defense attorneys argued for a change of venue, pointing out that pre-trial publicity had made it impossible to find impartial jurors. The motion was denied. They argued that Marcus Wheeler's confession should be excluded because of his intellectual disability and the coercive interrogation techniques used to obtain it. The motion was denied. They argued that there was no physical evidence connecting any of the defendants to the crime. The court was unmoved. The prosecution's case relied almost entirely on Marcus's confession and testimony from witnesses who claimed to have heard Damien make incriminating statements. One witness was a teenage girl who said Damien had told her at a softball game that he had killed the boys. Another was a man who claimed to have overheard Damien bragging about the murders in a restaurant. Both witnesses had serious credibility problems. The teenage girl had a history of mental illness and had initially told police she knew nothing about the case. The man had been seeking reward money and had connections to law enforcement. Neither could provide corroborating details, but the prosecution had something more powerful than evidence. They had fear. They had a community's desperate need to believe that evil could be identified and punished. They had 3 teenagers who looked like exactly what Middle America imagined when it pictured satanic killers. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. 3 hours to decide the fate of 3 young men. 3 hours to weigh evidence that should have taken weeks to properly examine. 3 hours to condemn Marcus. Wheeler was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison plus 40 years. Jason Caldwell was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Damien Mercer was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death by lethal injection. He was 19 years old. For 18 years, Damien Mercer waited to die. And in that waiting, he discovered something that would become his only salvation. The truth has a way of surfacing. No matter how deep it's buried, death row in Arkansas was a place designed to break the human spirit. Damien spent 23 hours a day in a cell roughly the size of a parking space, with 1 hour allocated for recreation in a concrete yard surrounded by razor wire. He had no physical contact with visitors, not his mother, not the attorneys who were working to save his life, not the supporters who had begun to rally around his case. In the early years, hope was almost impossible to maintain. Appeals were denied with mechanical regularity. The courts seemed uninterested in examining the evidence or lack thereof. The world outside moved on while Damien remained frozen in time, counting the days until the state would end his life for crimes he had never committed. But something began to change in the late 1990s. Journalists started looking more closely at the case. Documentary filmmakers came to Ridge Creek and began asking questions that had never been properly answered. Defense attorneys uncovered new evidence that painted a very different picture of what had happened in May 1993. The DNA testing that had been unavailable at the time of the trial was now sophisticated enough to analyze trace evidence from the crime scene. When those tests were finally conducted, The results were explosive. None of the genetic material recovered from the victims matched Damien, Jason, or Marcus. Not a single hair, not a drop of blood, not a skin cell. Instead, the DNA pointed toward other individuals, entirely including a hair consistent with Terry Hobbs, the stepfather of one of the murdered boys. The new evidence should have freed them immediately, but the system that had convicted them refused to admit its mistake. By 2011, the case had become a national cause. Celebrities had taken up the defense, contributing millions of dollars to legal efforts. Documentaries had exposed the flaws in the original investigation to audiences around the world. Even some of the original jurors had publicly stated that they would have voted differently if they had known what they now knew. The state of Arkansas found itself in an impossible position. The DNA evidence made it clear that the convictions were deeply flawed. The ongoing appeals were likely to succeed, potentially resulting in retrials that the state might well lose. But admitting error would mean acknowledging that Arkansas had kept an innocent man on death row for nearly 2 decades. The Alford plea offered a way out for everyone except the 3 men who had lost their youth, their freedom, and nearly their lives. Under an Alford plea, Damien, Jason, and Marcus would plead guilty while maintaining their innocence. They would accept time served for their convictions, allowing them to walk free immediately. In exchange, the state would avoid the embarrassment of exoneration and the potential liability of wrongful imprisonment. Lawsuits, it was, in essence, a deal with the devil. Freedom in exchange for a lie. Life in exchange for admitting to crimes they had never committed. In that conference room, with the document before him, Damien Mercer faced the most impossible choice imaginable. But what would you have done in his place? The attorneys explained the terms carefully. If Damien rejected the plea, he would remain on death row while appeals continued. Those appeals might take years. They might succeed, or they might not. The state had already proven its willingness to execute him. There was no guarantee that legal technicalities would save his life. If he accepted the plea, he would be free within days. He would be able to rebuild whatever remained of his life. He would see his mother again. He would walk on grass and feel rain on his face. He would have a future, even if that future came with an asterisk. But accepting would mean saying the words, standing in a courtroom and pleading guilty to the murders of 3 children. It would mean validating the system that had stolen 18 years of his life. It would mean letting the real killer, whoever that was, escape accountability forever. Damien looked at Jason, who had aged from a hopeful 16-year-old artist into a man approaching middle age, his dreams of creativity replaced by the endless grey monotony of prison life. He looked at Marcus, who still struggled to understand the legal complexities that had destroyed his life, who had spent nearly 2 decades paying for a confession that had been extracted through manipulation and coercion. They had all suffered. They had all lost decades that could never be recovered. And now they had to decide whether to accept a compromise that violated everything they believed about truth and justice. The silence in the room stretched for what felt like hours. On August 19, 2011, the 3 men walked into a Crittenden County courtroom for what would be their final appearance. The courtroom was packed with supporters, journalists, family members of the victims, and officials who had been involved in the case for nearly 2 decades. The atmosphere was electric with tension. Everyone present understood that they were witnessing something unprecedented, something that defied easy categorization as either victory or defeat. Judge David Laser called the proceedings to order. One by one, Damien, Jason, and Marcus approached the bench. One by one, they entered Alford pleas, acknowledging that the state had sufficient evidence to convict them at a new trial while maintaining their innocence of the crimes charged. The words felt like ash in Damien's mouth. Guilty. He was saying he was guilty. After 18 years of proclaiming his innocence, after fighting every day to clear his name, after surviving death row through sheer determination and the knowledge that he had done nothing wrong, he was standing in a courtroom and saying the word that made him a murderer in the eyes of the law. The judge accepted the pleas. Time served was credited against their sentences. The 3 men who had entered that courtroom as prisoners would leave as free men, but forever branded as killers who had merely avoided punishment through legal maneuvering. When Damien stepped outside the courthouse, the Arkansas sun hit his face for the first time in 18 years without the barrier of prison walls or escort vehicles. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions. Supporters cheered. Some wept openly, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the moment. But Damien felt nothing like celebration. He felt hollow, emptied out, as if the price of his freedom had been some essential part of his soul that could never be recovered. He was alive. He was free. And he was officially a child killer who had never killed anyone. The paradox would follow him for the rest of his life. The years since that August day have been a complicated journey, one that raises questions we should all be asking about justice, truth, and the price of freedom. Damien Mercer has rebuilt his life, piece by piece, in ways that would have seemed impossible during those 18 years on death row. He has written books about his experience. He has spoken publicly about wrongful conviction and the death penalty. He has become an advocate for others who remain trapped in a system that values closure over truth. Jason Caldwell has returned to art, finally pursuing the dreams that were stolen from him at 16. His work often explores themes of confinement and freedom, capturing in visual form the psychological journey from captivity to liberation. He rarely speaks publicly about the case, preferring to let his art communicate what words cannot express. Marcus Wheeler has struggled more than the others. The intellectual limitations that made him vulnerable to coercion in 1993, making it difficult for him to navigate a world that has changed dramatically in his absence. He lives quietly, far from the media attention that surrounds his co-defendants, trying to build a normal life in a world that sees him as a confessed murderer. None of them received compensation from the state of Arkansas. The Alford plea they accepted prevented them from suing for wrongful imprisonment. The state that took 18 years of their lives gave them nothing in return except the freedom that should never have been taken in the first place. The real killer, whoever murdered Michael Patterson, Stephen Marshall, and Christopher Wilson on that May evening in 1993, has never been identified. The case officially remains solved, with 3 convicted killers who maintain their innocence. No new investigation has been opened. No new suspects have been pursued. 3 families still grieve, children who died without justice. And 3 men live with convictions for crimes they did not commit. The story of Damien Mercer and the Ridge Creek 3 forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about a justice system that would rather maintain the appearance of certainty than admit the reality of doubt. Every year in America, wrongful convictions come to light. DNA evidence exonerates men and women who have spent decades behind bars. Eyewitness testimony proves unreliable. Confessions obtained through coercion collapse under scrutiny. And yet, the The system that produces these errors rarely examines itself with the same rigor it applies to those it prosecutes. In 1993, Ridge Creek, Arkansas was gripped by fear of the unknown, fear of the different, fear that evil could strike anywhere and that only vigilance could protect the innocent. That fear led a community to sacrifice 3 of its own children on the altar of closure, to accept a story that made sense emotionally even though it made no sense factually. Damien was different. Jason was quiet. Marcus was vulnerable. In a town looking for monsters, they were easy to cast as villains. Their convictions served a purpose beyond justice. They allowed a traumatized community to believe that the threat had been identified and neutralized, that order had been restored, that such horror could never happen again because the people responsible were safely behind bars. But the horror did happen again, not in the woods of Robin Hood Hills, but in courtrooms and prison cells, in the slow destruction of 3 young lives, in the choice between dying for truth and living with lies. Some say the system worked because Damien, Jason, and Marcus are free. Some say the system failed because they were convicted in the first place. The truth, as always, is more complicated. The system bent but did not break, producing an outcome that satisfied no one completely but allowed everyone to move forward without fully confronting what had gone wrong. As we reflect on this story, we're left with questions that have no easy answers, but perhaps asking them is the first step toward ensuring this never happens again. What does justice mean when it requires the innocent to plead guilty? What does freedom mean when it comes wrapped in lies? What does truth mean when speaking it might cost you your life? Damien Mercer made his choice. He chose life over truth, freedom over principle, the chance to exist over the certainty of extinction. We cannot judge that choice without facing it ourselves. None of us can truly know what we would do until we sit in that conference room, staring at those documents, weighing the years we might have against the soul we might lose. The children of Ridge Creek deserve to rest knowing their killers faced justice. Michael Patterson, Stephen Marshall, and Christopher Wilson were innocent victims whose murders remain essentially unsolved. Their families have endured decades of pain, caught between the official story and the evidence that contradicts it, unable to find the closure that a proper investigation might have provided. And Damien, Jason, and Marcus deserve to live without the shadow of crimes they did not commit. They lost their youth, their freedom, and nearly their lives to a system that valued convenience over truth. They were children themselves in 1993, teenagers whose only crime was being different in a town that feared difference. The devil's bargain they accepted was not their bargain. It was ours. It was the bargain a society makes when it decides that someone must be punished, when it allows fear to override evidence, when it accepts easy answers to hard questions. They paid the price. We must ask ourselves whether we're willing to keep extracting it. If this story moved you, please subscribe to The Cost of Truth for more powerful narratives about justice, courage, and the human spirit. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What would you have done in Damien's place? Accept freedom built on a lie, or maintain your innocence even if it meant death? Do you believe the Alford plea represents justice, or does it allow the system to escape accountability for its mistakes? Your voice matters. These conversations shape how we think about justice, truth, and the price we're willing to pay for both. Drop a comment and let us know what you think. The names and locations in this story have been changed to protect privacy, but the emotional and moral truth of the events depicted is based on real cases of wrongful conviction that have challenged our understanding of justice in America.